the meeting. Welcome, colleagues. Welcome to the public dialogue and basically a multiple stakeholder dialogue under the title of the ANC's International Relations, Navigating a Changing International Strategic Landscape. Now, colleagues, this particular dialogue comes at a time, at an opportune moment, as the African National Congress is heading towards its national policy conference, but also in an important year where it is moving and making preparations towards its national conference, an elective conference. And this is quite important because in recent times, the ANC has released to the public discussion papers touching on various elements, both domestic but also international. Within the realm of international relations, it produced a paper titled In Pursuit of Progressive Internationalism in a Changing World. And I think what brings us here today is essentially to interrogate elements of the working and discussion document, but also to invite multiple stakeholders to give their input and their analysis, not only on the discussion document, but their general observations of the strengths, the weaknesses, and opportunities for the ANC's international relations. And many of you would know that in terms of the IGD's work on foreign policy, we do try to engage multiple stakeholders, both at a national, provincial, but also when it comes to the various political parties. And I think one of the interesting traditions within the ANC has been that of releasing its policy documents in order to allow even non-ANC members to actually give their inputs. And I think this presents an opportunity for us to do exactly that as the party prepares for its national policy conference. We are joined by various stakeholders who are working on various elements of South African foreign policy. Those include Ms. Sanusha Naidu at the Institute for Global Dialogue, Professor Antoni van Niekerk at the University of South Africa, Ambassador Welly Lentlapo, who is a former national security advisor. We also have Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And of course, we are joined by Minister Lindiwe Zulu, but not in her capacity as the minister, but in her capacity as the chair of the ANC International Relations Subcommittee. And how we are structuring it today is she will provide initial inputs, not necessarily a presentation, full presentation of the ANC's policy document. She's already done that at various platforms, such as a media briefing recently held where the policy documents were disseminated and where they were distributed further. But what she's going to do is give very brief remarks, which then pave the way for some of our other respondents to initially interrogate some of those elements of the policy document and the broader ANC international relations, with the aim that the key inputs that come from today would also in some way feed into the discussions that would take place at the ANC's National Policy Conference, but bring together even voices from outside of the ANC. And this is really a key rationale behind this particular dialogue. So without having to say anything further, let me open or give the floor to Minister Lindiwe Zulu, to provide some of her opening and initial remarks before we invite some of our respondents to interrogate elements of the ANC's international relations. Minister Zulu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that presentation, Philani. And firstly, I'd like to thank you and everyone who made sure that this webinar takes place today, and actually is taking place at the time or during like the eve of the policy conference, and the policy conference will be starting towards the end of the week. But I also would like to thank the other stakeholders, people who we know very well that are in the space of international relations and foreign policy, discussion, debate, improvement and changing of policy whenever that needs to happen. But I think it's also people that represent South Africa's foreign policy and international relations wherever they go, because I'm very much aware that here we have people that on day-to-day basis engage on issues of international relations in their different areas of work. Thank you very much for coming through. And I'm also wishing to thank the members of the panel who are going to be engaging here. And upfront, I want to say that this is the plan of the African National Congress for all subcommittees of the ANC. We were requested to have engagements within and outside the ANC itself to make sure that we listen to other people and we listen to other opinions and we listen to other people's thinking around international relations, so that we enrich the discussions that will take place at policy conference, because it's not everybody that will get the chance to be there. And therefore, for me today is an addition to what we've already been doing, because even towards the finalization of the paper, we did engage, and I must thank the comrades who have been consistently been with us in the drafting, in the fixing here and there of the document, to the final adoption of the document that had to be adopted by the National Executive Committee. I do also want to say the processes, because I'm taking advantage of the fact that many people who are here are not people who sit in the NEC itself. The policy papers, as Philani said, were published, and also we had a chance as IR to also last week, Monday, we had a press briefing, which was organized obviously by the DIP of the ANC, a press briefing, and the attendance by the media was quite impressive. And we were able to clarify certain things that they wanted clarity on from us. So comrades and friends who are here, Tembu has already indicated the theme of the document. And also I'd like to say that this document also would have to work closely with the document of peace and stability, because these two committees always have to consistently work with each other. But I must indicate that this year, or since COVID actually, we had plans where we were even planning to have such meetings where we bring both the IR, international relations, and peace and stability for conversations. In fact, at some point, we're even thinking that we will bring IR, bring including we're going to bring the economic transformation one, so that, because all these things we believe are interlinked and interconnected. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that. Let me just indicate, Tulani, maybe you might make a note of this, including yourself, Pilani. You might make a note that before the national conference itself in December, it might be a good idea for us to go beyond ourselves, bring the other committees of the ANC that are relevant to having this kind of a meeting, because the interlinkages and the things that we need to talk about collectively will be of interest. Let me just make the reason why I say this. I just came back from the conference in KwaZulu-Natal, and I think many of you were surprised to see the people who were wearing those scarves on their heads, and those people who are calling themselves the comrades, who are calling themselves the Taliban. And we had to sort of like get into discussion around the implications of some of our own comrades naming themselves that way, and thinking that that is a good thing to do. And so we had the discussion, we had to put it at plenary, that they need to go and have a conversation whether they really want to be associated with this. And we explained why we thought it wasn't a very good idea. It might be good locally because of whatever internal dynamics, but they need to look at it from a broad perspective as to the image of the ANC and what the international community might look at, because KwaZulu-Natal is a very big province, and it's a very vibrant province. Hence, I'm thinking that part of what we need to do is to bring the other committees, but also extend these discussions particularly to provinces. Provinces are participating, and I was very excited at the conference itself because they were asking the very questions that are in the document itself, which gave me at least hope that what we used to have as a problem when we go to policy conferences, we have very few people coming to international relations because they think international relations is a special area of discussion that needs professors and all that. And we've always had less people coming for the discussion, but yesterday's conference where we had to participate and the questions were coming from the floor, they were not imposed by anyone. It gave me a sense that comrades are very interested. So I'm very happy that you have organized this meeting, and I express my gratitude to all of you for your participating in this webinar on international relations, where we will be engaging on the receiving your input as I have done. The policy conference is running from the 28th to the 31st of July. And to this end, this panel discussion will focus on proposals on how to navigate a changing international strategic landscape, given shifting international balance of forces. Those balance of forces, again, were discussed in KwaZulu-Natal, and some of the things that we ourselves as IRU have been discussing around decisions of conference that were taken and not being implemented. They were very vociferous about that and saying the ANC must implement decisions that are taken by conference, and if there are difficulties, those must be communicated not only to ourselves as the National Executive Committee. They were demanding that they want to know why, for instance, a decision on Israel doesn't seem to be taking place, why, for instance, our role in the African continent feels like it's waning and the influence of the ANC is waning, why BRICS, in their view, the issues of BRICS are not taking center stage. Is it because of the dynamics of Ukraine and all that? So those are just some of the things that they were raising, which was very exciting for me. And therefore, for the benefit of those who do not know, the ANC policy development process is as follows. We start off with developing the policy discussion paper. We open this up for critical debate and scrutiny by branches and ecosystem stakeholders. And this culminates in the policy conference to further deliberate and then take this to the national conference for endorsement. So I want, as just in my opening remarks, I'd like to request Pilani and all who are here, because you belong to institutions that can be helpful here. I'd like us to have these discussions, not because we're going to policy conference, not because we're going to the last conference in December. These things need consistency because the dynamism of the world and the changing dynamics of the world, the conflicts, the struggles that we are facing as progressive forces, we need to be consistent in the discussion so that we don't necessarily have to wait. So some things we need to put calendars and say, come post December conference, or we start now. We say towards conference, post policy conference, what are we going to do in between? And then after the conference, what else are we going to do so that ultimately we can feel the dynamism and the support that we get from yourselves. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I'm happy that we have panelists who are going to discuss. Thank you for the opportunity for opening the meeting.
Thank you very much. And I think this is exactly how it must be seen. We must see this not as an event, but this is an ongoing process, both through closed formats, but also through open dialogues to engage decision makers who are in this area of international relations. And I think before I invite our panelists to just give some opening remarks, also relatively concise remarks, I would sort of put the question out there in a sense that the ANC's discussion document is on the pursuit of progressive internationalism in a changing world. Now, some stakeholders have critiqued South African foreign policy. They've critiqued the ANC's international relations. They've critiqued at times whether it remains as dynamic as it should be in order to shape and continue to engage in a fast changing global order. And I think I would want our respondents to consider these questions and to consider whether the crafting of these documents, whether what we are seeing playing out in the real world, whether the ANC's international relations is essentially fit for purpose. And I think this is something that we must interrogate and must interrogate with the chair of the ANC's International Relations Subcommittee in the same room with us, and therefore feed into discussions that would go into the policy conference, but even beyond the policy conference, because international relations is always changing, it's dynamic. And so I see that Professor Siphamandla Zondi is here with us. I am not sure if his microphone is already linked up. If colleagues could assist with that. Professor Zondi, Minister Zulu has just given an overview, essentially, of the process that goes into crafting the ANC's international relations, and just for your benefit. And she was just giving that overview and basically challenging us to continue on that path. And so I see that he's also just, he's probably having some technicality issues, because I saw he was in and now he's out. So instead of Professor Zondi kicking it off, the discussion, I would like to invite a colleague at IGD, followed by another colleague, but at a different institute, the South African Institute of International Affairs, Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. So we'll start with those two, and then we'll make our way down the initial remarks, just sort of, interrogating that question, responding to some of what Minister Zulu has said, but also to the policy document itself. Sanusha, just initial sort of remarks from you.
Thank you very much, Palani. Greetings to the Minister, Ambassador Nhlapo, my colleagues on the panel, and of course, participants online. I think I really appreciate the way the Minister had contextualized process for us, but also opened up the space in terms of this is not just a once-off engagement, it's a continuous engagement, a consultation that helps to build the process around what you raised, Palani, as what is the fit for purpose and the value proposition with regard to the ANC or the party's international relations on this context. And I think there's 2 or 3 points I'd like to make in terms of pulling out what I thought were key issues in the document. It's very difficult to structure a document when you're dealing with a global context that's constantly in a state of fluidity and it's moving very fast. And so obviously these documents are trying to be as contemporary, as trying to be as salient as possible in terms of providing the context, providing the characterization, the nature of a system that is in a constant state of volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity. And a lot of that is based on how do you capture the essence of what's happening in a changing global architecture. And I think that we have to appreciate the document in that way in terms of how close it comes to try and provide us with that snapshot picture, but trying to put everything into a document also becomes quite a difficult task. So obviously, a lot of gratitude, appreciation, and kudos to the authors and the consultation that went through the process in terms of trying to fit this changing architecture from where we were with the pre-COVID world, the COVID world, and where we're moving towards now in terms of the tail end of this COVID centric engagement that we have, but also towards the kind of peace and stability. I think the one thing I picked up from the document, which was very key, is the idea that Africa is still a very central feature and an important focal point or pivotal point in South Africa, in the party's international relations, in environment engagement, but also in terms of the state's relationship to the continent, and of course, how that informs the relationship to the global arena. I felt that it needed to be much more embedded or much more clearer in terms of where we need to see the central feature of the Africa policy. And I think it was a point that the minister raised in terms of some of the key issues that came out from the discussions at the provincial level over the weekend with regard to is South Africa's Africa policy beginning to find its own kind of challenges around fit for purpose, engagement, what is the kind of relationship we are crafting with different African actors in terms of the regional as well as the continental. I think it was in that way, it could have been a little bit more specific around the role of SADC, the role of the region, the role that South Africa played in terms of peace, stability, and development, which were key issues that informed our foreign policy in the early period after 94, but also remains a significant area in terms of how do we see this linking up to the pillars that came out in the document, which I saw was for 4, and that is the kind of social justice struggles that we have to deal with, the new impulses of instability, intrastate conflict, challenges of exclusion by people who feel that they're not part of the system, as well as this question of human security. And I think this is where the document could align much more with the other policy discussion papers, which the minister had also raised in her opening remarks around not seeing this document as an independent document or an isolated document from the rest of the policy discussion papers. It talks to the economic policy discussion paper, it talks to the peace and stability, it talks to our dynamics around issues around questions of economic development, socioeconomic development, and so forth. And I think that relates to how we actually look at the document as an intersection between the domestic and the international and the domestic, particularly in the regional and the continental context. The second point I want to make here is the question around the identification of some of of some of the weaknesses that kind of underpin the capacity and the capability and the resources question around the foreign policy engagement, but also in terms of implementation. I think it's very important that those issues were recognized in the document. And most importantly, I think it brings out the kinds of the planning process of what our planning process is in the context of not just the 5-year plan, but much more in terms of how do you set benchmarks around the 5-year plan and even beyond the 5-year plan in terms of what kind of cohesive foreign policy, international relations engagement you're looking at, and what are going to be your strategic pivotal areas in terms of operationalization, but also in terms of setting out where Africa fits in this hierarchy and how do you move from the regional, continental to the multilateral and to the more broader global context in terms of international frameworks and so forth. And I think this is where the national interest reference in the discussion document was quite important in terms of understanding what the international interest reference is, what informs this national interest, but also understanding whether the way progressive internationalism is defined and conceptualized, not only within the context of Africa, but also on the outskirts of Africa, in the broader global community as well, in terms of what are we talking about and are we synergizing and synchronizing those dynamics of what we want to bring about in terms of a just, equitable, non-racial, non-patriarchal society, a better Africa, a better world, those kinds of very important phrases, but they need to have traction in some kind of cohesiveness and some kind of implementation of policy, which I think comes out. The third point I'll make, look, Palani, and I'm just looking most importantly at time, and I don't want to overstep the time, is I think the language is very important. Language is important in terms of how it creates decisiveness in what you're trying to achieve. There's very important recommendations made under the 5 pillars in terms of what needs to be going forward. But I would think that pick out of those 5 pillars, pick what you think are the 2 or 3 most important strategies that you want to implement in the 5-year plan, and then take it forward in terms of your medium and long-term plan. Because to me right now, that those recommendations are important, but they need to have a little bit more substance to what are the targets that are going to achieve those objectives that you create under those 5 pillars. And I think that will give the language much more traction in terms of practice, pragmatic approaches, etc., to what is the world around us, but also understanding how this world never stays static and it's in a fluid state of constant evolution and constant change. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Palani.
Thank you very much, Sanusha, and I'm glad I started with you just to give us that, because I think you've highlighted some key areas there for improvement within the document itself, but also key areas that I think the subcommittee of the ANC's international relations can actually keep taking forward post conference. I think one of the areas you also touch on, which are important, is in the document making perhaps more explicit reference to its relationship to the other documents, and to the other policy documents. And I think this reminds me, for instance, of the sort of time when the ANC had actually an independent Department of International Affairs. So if we all remember the sort of evolution of the ANC's international relations, we would know that there was a fully fledged Department of International Affairs, which actually fed all aspects of the ANC's work, both domestic but also international. And perhaps there's something to think about there. Colleagues, as I invite other speakers, please note that we do have the chat function open. We do have the Q&A also open. So feel free to just type in your questions also. And of course, to also raise your hands as we move forward, and we'll recognize those. Colleagues, let me invite from the South African Institute of International Affairs, Ms. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, to just give us some of her impressions, and also to just remind us that she will have to head out shortly after 6 o'clock. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Palani. Thank you, Minister, also for the opportunity to engage, and very glad to see that this. I think there are some very important opportunities for keeping the dialogue going. After all, we're all on the same team. Let me. I've made some notes, speaking notes on a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to share that with you. What I am going to do, though, is maybe frame some of the broad issues, and then pick up on just a few points. And fortunately, I'm going to, I think, probably overlap with some of the observations that Sanusha and Palani have made. And I think it's always useful to hear it from multiple people, because then we're all on. It seems we're all on the same page. I think, and the document does that well, is to set out that this is a global international environment, very much in flux. It's extremely fragmented. It's very polarized. I think the risks are great. And, you know, the sort of the point that one takes away from that is that our default thinking modes need to be recalibrated, because the environment is not like anything I think we've seen before. I don't think any of us remember the end of the Second World War, but it's certainly very different from then. And I would argue it's also very different from the end of the Cold War and the period that followed. You know, it's much more globalized, much more integrated. And what is critical, and we've seen that emerge really strongly in the last couple of years, is you know, our ability or lack thereof as a global community really to respond to multiple overlapping global crises, whether it has to do with pandemics or climate change, or indeed what we do when the global institutions that are supposed to help us navigate these are actually absent, and the leaders in those institutions, and I would argue among leading powers, are also failing to provide leadership. So that's by way of framing. Then just to sort of move on to, we talk about progressive internationalism. At the core of that is really social justice and solidarity, as you've said, Minister, as the document sort of articulates strongly. And I think the other big elephant in the global environment is the issue of heightened inequality, which the last 2 years have made much worse, and how that manifests itself in the rise of the far right and extremism across the world, and also here in South Africa in the rise of xenophobia. And I want to highlight that because, and I think the document recognizes the criticality of that, because that sort of that action, that trend in domestically around xenophobia does undermine not only our Africa policy, but also the values that are espoused in terms of social justice, fairness, equity, solidarity, and so on. I just want to highlight that. And then the second point I want to highlight, also in that context of this fluidity of and the absence of institutions and the erosion of norms and rules. Some of that I think is not a problem. You know, we all agree that the global system as it is now needs to reform. But I think what is very important is that we should all be conscious about what parts of the current international order we feel need to be supported and which ones need to be reformed. And I think that's critical. We don't necessarily want to throw everything out, but we just need to be very clear about what we want to keep, not just what we want to throw out. So overall, I think just in terms of the context, you know, a good analysis of the lay of the land. I think it's very important that the document talks about resources, resources are critical in the execution. You cannot give equal attention to all the issues. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, where can you be most effective in policy changes, in policy processes? And importantly, I think, where can you complement government? Because there are areas where the ANC as a party can have impact and can do things. The government often has to operate within constraints. If you're talking about, for example, global negotiations, whether it's the IMF or elsewhere, it requires trade-offs. I think political parties can be much stronger as political parties, rather than as the government, can be much stronger advocates for particular lines, for particular reforms, changes, and so on. And I think certainly in that domain, the ANC can play a stronger coordinating and advocacy role in continental, global, progressive formations, building networks and partnerships. And there I would say, critically, it's about building those partnerships across North-South divides. Because if we're going to make progress on many of these things, I think we need to find people, organizations, institutions, formations with which we share common values. And these are across the divide, and I think that's an important dimension in terms of recalibrating our thinking that we need to engage in. I think another dimension that is important, now moving on to some of the more thematic issues, is I think it's important to understand better the growing fragmentation within the South. China in particular is an emerging superpower with its own specific geopolitical interests. Our interests, I think, sometimes converge, sometimes they diverge. But we need to be very clear about that dynamic and that relationship in terms of how we chart our own foreign policy in that regard. I think my next point, I think, touches on what Sanusha was saying a little bit. I framed it a little differently, and I've said here, how would you measure success? What are the critical success factors that at the end of a 5-year period you can say, yes, we've achieved this, we've moved the ball on this a little bit, even if we haven't achieved everything, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, I think it is important to identify, and I think I say that elsewhere in one of my slides, sub themes within issues that have been identified under the various pillars that are actually, some of them might be low-hanging fruits and easy to move the ball on. Others might be more difficult, but it might be important to begin the process. And I think that kind of reflection as the document is rolled out, I think would be very important. Foreign policy at the end of the day is, of course, about advancing the national interest. We've heard about that. And critical to that, of course, if foreign policy does not also reflect and seek to advance and seek to tackle some of the domestic challenges, then it can't be seen to be relevant to the people. And I think, Minister, your observation about the really good engagement you had yesterday or the day before on foreign policy in that regard, I think is absolutely a very good sign. But we can say that even in the absence of the national interest document, in terms of it being made public, we can say that jobs, employment, are core national interest. I think that everybody would agree on, and that is why I think the focus highlighting the issue of economic diplomacy in the document, I think, is very important. We need to highlight what the party wants to focus on to support the government's efforts. And one of the things I was reflecting on, and you kind of preempted me, Minister, was a sort of a cross-committee sub-working group that focuses on leveraging the parties' partnerships abroad, but also sort of weighing in from an economic transformation perspective. Some of the dimensions around conflict, because economics are also about conflict, and then, of course, the foreign policy elements. I want to just spend a little bit of time, not too much, Pilani, but just to focus a little bit on global governance, my particular pet focus these days, and to say that absolutely, you know, both the ANC and sort of the government and South African state recognize the critical role of an effective multilateral global governance system. And so when we talk about advancing the national interest, clearly how the global superstructure helps or sort of makes that more difficult is very important. And particularly it has significant impact on development, on sustainable development. And so I think in this pillar, what would be really useful would be, again, to identify and this is what Sanusha also said, 2 to 3 key issues with specific outcomes that one could pursue in the next 5 years. For example, you've flagged and raised the issue of the IMF and the World Bank and climate change. And as you probably know, the IMF has been incorporating climate change into its Article 4 surveillance reports. We saw some of it in the report that came out for South Africa earlier this year. It's still early days. The IMF itself will recognize that they have much to learn. But this is now the critical point where voices on how to actually ensure that the inclusion of an assessment of transition risks, spillover risks, physical risks, in the way in which states are assessed and evaluated is critical. This is an opportunity to actually be able to make an impact on how these policies evolve and make it into concrete rules and regulations. And I think there are interesting partnerships that one can explore around social formations that follow these issues and where probably from the perspective of progressive internationalism, I think are very much on the same page. And the same would go then for climate change and the just transition. These are critical issues for the global south. It's about mobilizing networks, but critically also thought leaders. You mentioned the point about the erosion, the sense of erosion of South Africa's sort of voice in African fora. I think being out there with critical thinking on many of these issues, helping to shape and influence the public and policy discourse, I think is one way of addressing that. And I specifically highlight climate change and the just transition because these are the new frontiers of politics. Those who can use them to their advantage will really be pioneers in the next industrial transformation. And then, Pilani, just 2 more points to finish off. The first is, and this is again in the document, but I want to put it in the context of party-to-party links. I think the document talks about the importance of good governance, transparency, accountability, some of the challenges that are facing the continent in that regard. And I think these issues are important to be part of the agenda in these discussions, particularly with ruling parties, because that addresses the challenges highlighted by the document in terms of both the political and developmental challenges. And then lastly, one thing that I think might be interesting to take forward in other fora as well, Pilani, in terms of some subsequent dialogues, is the concept that has emerged among Latin American scholars called active non-alignment. It's fairly recent. The book that captured it is still in Spanish, so that's how new it is. It will be translated later in the year. This active non-alignment does not mean one is neutral, but it is about the refusal to align automatically with one or another power and to put national interests first. So a kind of non-alignment 2.0. I know Minister Pandor has spoken about the importance of rekindling non-alignment. I think this is a pragmatic approach as our economic interests and interests, for example, regarding transformation of the global order to a fairer one mean that we need partnerships with both the North and the South, the East and the West. And really the challenge in this growing a world that is increasingly polarized and fragmented is how we navigate that. And it requires us to think quite carefully, together with other, I would argue, mid-sized powers in the global south, the kind of platforms, institutions, and coordination that would allow us to really execute such an initiative, such a trend effectively. Let me stop there, Pilani.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for that input. And I think also sort of ending in terms of thinking about what does non-alignment mean in the changing landscape in contemporary times. But also one area that you and Sanusha seem to touch on is the area of further prioritization or a disaggregated view when it comes to engagements both within the global south and the global north. And I think that plays out quite well with the idea of progressive internationalism, because of course, progressive internationalism is not necessarily principles that are applicable only in the global south. So you may have key actors in the global north who actually share the principles of progressive internationalism, may not necessarily share all the detail in terms of foreign policy directions, but from a principled point. And I think that really is about how then do we form bridges both in the south, but also in the north, keeping in mind that some of these fragmentations are not only taking place within the north, but are also playing themselves out in the global south. So some food for thought there. And I think with that being said, I would like to invite Professor Siphamandla Zondi and hand the floor to him. He is at the University of Johannesburg, and I would like to just get some of his impressions and some initial input, especially also focused on this idea of actually taking progressive internationalism and ensuring that it is actually enacted also in the real world, especially in an environment where you do have a rise in certain quarters of far-right movements, which of course would not necessarily agree with the principles of progressive internationalism. Professor Zondi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Velas, and apologies to everyone. Had bandwidth issues, had connection issues. Yeah, so, but I was able to follow the conversation. Let me just say this to preface my comments. The first one is that it relates to the importance of ideology to navigate a constantly changing and a challenging international environment that is partly shaped by clash of ideologies or work of ideology globally. The correctness of finding some ideological frame to discipline our approach or the approach to the international environment that is shaped by ideological permutations that are in there. Many people agree that the international order is dominated by a particular ideology, and that ideology is a neoliberal ideology. We must accept that it has many successes that it has, including the particular type of globalization that has enabled a number of countries to be very rich and very successful without making other countries successful. It has been very successful, therefore, for a particular portion of the world, and has been a disaster for the other parts of the world, especially the larger part of the developing world, and perhaps with a few exceptions of those countries that have been able to graduate from underdeveloped to developing, or to developed, and so on. And that neoliberal agenda, neoliberal ideology, is a specific about assumptions about the world. And these assumptions do not reflect the history of those who were not part of the key actors in the First and the Second World War that shape this current order. In other words, we're not part of the earlier order, which was a liberal order, or the earlier order, which was a colonial order. All these orders in succession, but actually part of the same system of life. Now that imposes upon countries in the developing world a big responsibility to think about how they think about international relations. Because what we do to internationalize, our interpretation of what the problem is and our interpretation of what the right courses of actions are directly impacted by what our ideological framing is. Now, some of the writings that look at different internationalisms that have existed for quite some time now in the world, look at the internationalism, especially of the last century and a half, suggest a number of internationalisms. I've mentioned colonial internationalism, mentioned liberal internationalism, mentioned neoliberal internationalism, but there's also socialist internationalism, and it was pushed by the Soviet Union and others, and governed quite a lot of what was done during the Cold War by the East. And then there is revolutionary internationalism, which is associated with revolutionary organizations, whose implication, this ideology's implication, is that there must be undoing of the current order and find a complete alternative. And of course, there is Marxist internationalism, which is also particular about the worker-based international system. And then, of course, we have progressive internationalism, which is a concept that has been around for quite a while, and it has been used to mean a combination of ideas, kind of like a combination of ideas that are to the left of the center, that are marked by at least 5 tendencies. One is faith in the international system, but a wish to reform it. 2 is faith in the international law and the operation of the international relations on the basis of international law, or the assumption that international law is a great leveler in an unequal international environment. 3, it is faith in international institutions produced by the Second World War, especially the United Nations, because of its inclusiveness and its ability to accommodate everyone and making decisions on the basis of consensus. You know that. 4, it's a belief in an international system underpinned by development outcomes, in the hope that that would help the underdeveloped and overcome underdevelopment. So it is affected by that concept of developmentalism and all of that, and the need to close the gap. 5 is an abiding belief in peace as supreme, as opposed to war as a possible solution. So almost a complete faith, almost religious faith in the notion of peace, dialogue as a means to solve a problem. 6 is the notion of solidarity, which goes beyond cooperation and all that. The concept of solidarity as an idea of collective response to shared problems, and that I don't elaborate that. You colleagues are very familiar with it. 7 is the abiding faith again in diplomacy, multilateral, bilateral, and all of those kinds of things. And therefore, active participation in all form of diplomacy, because it is believed that diplomacy can amplify the voice of those militarily who would have been nothing, and all of those. So there's 7 that we can come up with more, but those 7 are very clear for me, clear marker of the idea of progressive internationalism. As I see it. Now in this document, the jury is out for all of us to think about how, to what extent does this document then do justice to that idea of developmentalism. My sense is that the progressive internationalism explains a couple of things in this document. One, let me just a couple, but again, allow me just to point out 4. The first one is the faith in global governance and multilateralism. The United Nations, it's very clear that it is there, while at the same time pushing for the reform of this very institution. It permeates the document right through. And that is extended to other institutions of multilateralism, including the G20, the non-aligned movement, the G7, 7 plus China, the BRICS, the African Union, and SADC. That the belief that we can solve problems through this multilateral forum is quite apparent in the whole thing. The second one is a critical look at conflict and militarism, a sort of a positioning away from and critical to any form of militarism. Whereas if you look at other internationalisms, especially the more dominant ones, there is room for militarism if the strategic objective is wise, if the strategic objective is good, is holy. The military interventions and all of those are absolutely critical. The opposition to the idea of unilateralism, be it sanctions, be it subversion, be it regime change, be it imposition, be it external debt, all of those things we can see it. And then perhaps lastly, a complete faith in the possibilities that come from international cooperation. The tone in relation to how the world has responded to COVID-19, for example, or in relation to how the developing countries have responded to issues of climate change on the basis of that principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and how the large majority of countries have responded to the need to implement the SDGs, which it sees as very much in the interest of South Africa to be fully implemented. So as not to exhaust your time and exhaust the discussion, I would like to take it there. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Prof. Zondi. And I think what is key there is an acknowledgement that ideology matters. So I think whenever there is a dominant ideology, whatever the ideology is, it would almost tend to make the assumption that it ceases to even become an ideology and it just becomes the norm. And therefore, any ideas which sort of divert from the dominant ideas of the day are then tended to be seen as an ideology. And so you have that contestation, I think, from time to time. And I think it does help to explain the certain policies that then emanate from an understanding of what progressive internationalism entails. Colleagues, we have two further speakers. I would ask first Professor Antoni van Niekerk at the University of South Africa, and immediately after Professor van Niekerk to invite Ambassador Nhlapo, who of course will be able, in his own way to also bring his vast experience as not only, I would say, a scholar, but also as a practitioner in the field of international relations, and to just synthesize some of these areas and then provide also recommendations on strengthening, particularly the ANC's international relations. Professor van Niekerk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philani. Good evening. I see we're beyond 6 o'clock, so I'll try and be brief. If your computer allows, and you look at the picture of Ambassador Nhlapo's screen save, you will see the three icons of our ANC's international relations sitting next to each other there. It's a brilliant picture, and I want to pay tribute to those three there. So that's by way of starting to say that we've been in this business for a long time, and it's getting more difficult by the day and by the year. I want to say three things. The first one is maybe make a comment on policy planning or policy making. The second one or two comments about the policy document in front of us, which has brought us together here. And then thirdly, maybe point to some ways going forward in a more practical manner. So to start off with, the relationship between political parties and ideology and public policy is not a new one. It's well written up in the literature. And in fact, some South Africans also write about this. And let me pick a rather provocative recent article that reflects on the relationship between party politics and policy outcomes by Kaya Sitole. He wrote in the Business Day recently about this. Not about international relations, but more broadly the relationship. And let me just give you the essence of his thinking. I find myself agreeing with him partly. He says since 1994, the translation of party policy into government action has not been easy. Since 1994, the translation of party policy into government action has not been easy. And he says, regrettably for the party, the problem with its policy formation is that it takes much of its direction from the eternal commitment to being an equal opportunity church where no one should feel alienated. And the inevitable outcome of this commitment is that ideologically irreconcilable positions are infused in the policy-making process. He gives a couple of examples. But he also says that for many years, or for too many years, the ANC has failed to acknowledge that the inability to be honest in its policy deliberations simply leads to implementation paralysis in the longer run. And he says in its current policy drafts, it yet again puts together a wide range of ideological wishes that are sometimes individually impractical given the state of the state the ANC presides over. And they are always collectively irreconcilable as the party still has no mechanism for defining what its anchor pillars are and how contributions towards policy should be guided by this. So this is the question that we've been discussing in the past hour. What is the ideology that underlies and drives the ANC as a movement? And then he concludes by saying that the lessons of what works and what doesn't work don't seem to seamlessly filter into the policy formulation process. And as a result, transformation just isn't working the way we thought it would. And so if you think this is a bit harsh, Philani, if you turn to the policy document, In Pursuit of Progressive Internationalism in a Changing World, it really, if you had the time to read it, colleagues, it is a catalogue of failures, challenges, misdirection, and the inability to harness progressive forces around a central, motivating theme. So I'm not going to summarize what is in the document. It's for all of us to read. The question rather is what is to be done. If the document itself, the ANC is telling us that it was unable in the past couple of years to bring together progressive forces to tackle that very important agenda of global reform on many levels. And so what is to be done? It's also very frank and honest about its own inabilities. It makes a raft of policy recommendations, and there are too many of them. So what I've done in my third and last point is I'm picking up on a couple of them that I think might be worth pursuing, if indeed there is meaning to our engagement, which is let's have an indaba, an ongoing dialogue between Minister Zulu and her colleagues, civil society activists, academia, and let me also say the citizens of the country, which I think sometimes we miss out on as we philosophize and theorize on foreign policy. In fact, the point that Minister Zulu made earlier on about saying to the conference delegates, when you choose the word Taliban, do you know what you are doing? That is really, really important. I'll come back to that point in a minute. So let me pick in no particular order of importance the kind of issues and research agendas that I think we can jointly pursue going forward. The document makes a lot about foreign policy or international relations being driven not only at national level, but increasingly at provincial or metro or even municipal level. So you will find that Cape Town has like an active foreign policy. It markets itself as, a world-class A, B, and C. Johannesburg is trying to do the same, and so on and so forth. This document says, how do we make sure that we align the kind of initiatives that our colleagues at different layers and levels want to take with national foreign policy direction? That is an important question. And in fact, Philani, we should ask ourselves, can we please now read the national interest document? Why is it, maybe the minister can elaborate on this, why is it that cabinet approved this, but we haven't seen it in this room? Unless I haven't seen it myself and others have. The second one is an old theme where the document says the ANC should develop a fully fledged economic diplomacy position. You mean we don't have a position on economic diplomacy? Dirko has. Many of us in the room, as Sanusha and others will know, we've been training, teaching, and doing research on this question of economic diplomacy because we all recognize it's part of the national interest. It's quite important. And so that's the second one where I think we can recover lost ground and consolidate what we have. Another one is that I find disturbing. There's a note of concern in my voice as I make my presentation. The ANC must take a policy position on the white paper. No, man, what is this? Is this the white paper on Ubuntu? Is this our foreign policy white paper? In fact, let me turn this around and say, the ANC must help develop a new white paper on foreign policy. Let's not review whether that white paper was withdrawn and what is its status and how it appears in the NDP and so on and so forth. Sanusha, I think, made the point, Elizabeth made the point, I think she left now, that the world is moving so fast. There are new dynamics. Let's find our anchor and put that in a draft discussion document that can become a white paper. And then the next one, it aligns quite closely on the same page of this document. The ANC needs to clarify its policy position regarding progressiveness. I'm quoting, "No, man, this can't be. This cannot be." You know, as I was listening to Zondi, I collected 3 publications from my shelf. Africa Rise Up, Perspectives on African Renewal, and then a CAF publication called Promoting Progressive African Thought Leadership. A third one by the Concerned African Forum the other day, as you know, Pilani, was a carefully crafted response to the war in Ukraine, or the war between Russia and NATO fought in Ukraine, and the consequences for the global South. A carefully crafted, in-depth document. It's a very strong position that I think needs to be circulated or aired or interrogated. And with it goes the idea that Elizabeth brings in of active non-alignment. I am in favor of us rethinking, picking up that concept and rethinking and modernizing it and Africanizing it. I think there's value in thinking about South Africa's foreign policy in non-aligned terms for the reasons that she advanced, but from African perspective. It says further, the ANC must ensure the government puts Africa back in the center of its foreign policy. You mean it doesn't? And if it doesn't, why is that? And what should be done to make it so? This is a critical question. I'm not raising this, I'm reading from the document. This is concerning, it's deeply concerning. And if this is true, then I think as it goes to the white paper and thinking about our anchor position, ideology if you want, let's go there in depth. In fact, a publication recently came out on South Africa's Africa strategy. Some of us in the room have chapters in there. The next point is a delicate one, Pilani. It says growing tensions among African foreign nationals and South Africans. And it talks about xenophobia and populism and so on. If you want to bring foreign policy and international relations to the people, and colleagues, if we want to make sure that we don't theorize and philosophize, but make sure that our policies speak to our people, and our people's interests, needs are reflected in the way that we talk policy, then this issue surely must be it. Then you bring Nanhla Lux into the room and you have that conversation with him or his movement, if you want. We can't avoid. In fact, that national interest document speaks to the needs of our people. And then I think, second last point, the ANC must consider developing its written position on women in and foreign policy, in foreign policy and on foreign policy. No, man. You mean the ANC has not developed a position on women in foreign policy? There are policy frameworks that speaks to this from the UN down. Many colleagues have worked on this endlessly in policy spaces. So we need to recover that lost ground as well, and very quickly. I think that's an important one. My last comment is, somebody said, I think the minister said, we're talking about international relations and foreign policy almost as if it's isolated from other policy domains or terrains. And I think we should stop doing that. We can't talk about international relations, foreign policy, our relations with our neighbors, our region, our continent, and beyond, if we don't also think about trade, economics, but also peace and security. In fact, there's a policy paper on that is as critical in my view as this foreign policy or international relations paper. In fact, we really need to think very critically about how we prevent a recurrence of the kind of July 2021 popular uprising, or whatever you want to call it. President Mbeki raised it again. It's on the policy agenda. And in fact, let me conclude with a big bang statement by saying we need nothing less than a security sector reform process to make sure that foreign affairs, intelligence, defense, the criminal justice system, and police and home affairs works together seamlessly so that we can do what is most necessary for a state to provide, which is to protect its own people and advance their interests. Thank you.
Antony, thank you very much for that. I think this was very useful. And I also one thing I want to pick up is that you've also challenged, I think, you've actually also challenged the ANC on some of the issues that it says it should develop, you know, let's say policy, and basically saying, but, you know, there should already be policy on these particular areas. And in fact, you know, there are various, let's say, guidelines on this, which would in fact be aligned to some of the principles that the ANC itself espouses, you know. So I think it's really also, you know, in as much as you've sort of gone through the document, analyzed some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses, but I think it's also a challenge to say, you know, we should not be in a point where we are still developing some of these policies, but, you know, that templates exist that are well aligned with the ANC's perhaps international relations, and that in fact the process of developing some of those policies should in fact be a lot quicker than you know, than we may at times assume, because you already have the actors who have been working on some of these issues. You already have these documents. So I think that's a key sort of area, which obviously it's also a challenge to further discussions, and that's where you started, that we need to continue sort of even a workshop format that invites various members of civil society, practitioners, in a continuous conversation. And it goes back to what Minister Zulu was also saying, that this should not be an event, but this should be an ongoing, because such points obviously would then be raised, you know, much earlier on. So thank you, colleagues, for that. And with that, I would like to invite, you know, somebody with a wealth of experience when it comes to international relations and foreign policy, but who has also seen, I think, the ANC's international relations, both prior to 1994 and also after 1994, and has been involved also in various roles within government. I'd like to give the floor to Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who's a former national security advisor. Ambassador Nhlapo, the floor is yours.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, no.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I must thank all the panelists who have spoken before me, and particularly the introductory remarks by Comrade Lindy Zulu, because I think she gave us a proper framework within which we should subject this document to scrutiny. Let me start by saying that what Anthony and Sanusha have said, particularly Sanusha, you know, language is very important in international relations and diplomacy. You've got to be deliberate and explicit. There cannot be any room for ambiguity, because once that happens, it gets open to interpretation by anybody. And therefore your positions will be continuously subjected to that kind of scrutiny because of the ambiguity in the language that you use. So let us be deliberate. Some of the things that Anthony has pointed out are very valid, and I think we need to look at them and tighten up where it is necessary. And I think it is important because for me, a discussion document like this one, with all its weaknesses that we have noted at the moment, might just be the best way to start looking at this international relations sphere with a deliberate effort. I'm saying this because every time I listen to commentators on radio and TV and reading in some of our media about our foreign policy, there are two things that come out consistently. South Africa has got no foreign policy. It's either those who say so don't read, don't understand, don't know, or they deliberately are being mischievous, because some of them are. Two, that our foreign policy is on autopilot. I know the term autopilot invokes a lot of irritation in a lot of people. But I think we need to examine even that aspect, because it then, to me, might relate to the development and implementation of foreign policy. Consistency that will have to be determined in that aspect. I can quote a number of examples which the document even talks about, and I hope it's something that we'll have to get even much more deeper into it. In terms of how we handled the issue of the ICC and came to the decisions that we've made and are seen to be retreating from in how we have treated the matter in the document. That could be part of the problems that indicate a certain weaknesses that might create an impression of this autopilot criticism. But I'm also saying that this document is also a reflection of the reality that we are having this policy document discussion and the policy conference in the absence of an NGC having taken place and having reviewed. Now we are doing both the work of the NGC and the foreign policy, which is not going to be easy. And we have to be conscious of that fact that there is that gap that we are trying to close, and we'll have to close it. Time is not on our side because we're dealing with an area that is a fast-moving target. Hardly 24 hours after the agreements have been signed between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey, there was an attack in Odessa. What are the implications? What it tells us is that one event cannot determine the direction in which the balance of forces is tilting, or the complexities around geopolitical manifestations and their impact on our domestic state of affairs. If this example cannot underscore the complexity and the intensity with which we are dealing with some of the issues which might need that, we have to be quick-footed, but accept that we are not going to be able to catch up with everything that we might want to deal with, as we have indicated here. Things are changing. Today, you'll have bilateral relations with the government. Tomorrow, it will be gone because of elections or because of a coup. How do you recalibrate those relations? What becomes the basis on which you continue your engagements? So my argument is that foreign policy principles that we adopt must withstand any developments that take place. Any developments that take place, including incumbency. brought about by whatever political changes. It should withstand that. Because if it is solid and tight enough and unambiguous, it will help us to develop the necessary tactics and practical options to deal with ongoing developments as they happen, because we're not responsible for everything that happens everywhere around us. Even the catalog of the issues that we have placed in this particular document. Everything changes, and we are not in charge, we are not in control, we are not going to determine that. But we need to have a standard reference that when anything of this nature happens, this is going to be our approach. But context will determine how we do it. It's context that must determine how we do it. And the options that will be available to us. And I think one of the things that we need to do, and it has been emphasized already, is that by its nature, international relations is cross-cutting. There is no way that you can avoid the reality that there are many actors, and that in our consideration, we should take that into effect. And I'm happy the document has done that, and the very forum that we are in today, it's a recognition of that reality. It's a recognition of that reality. You know, the fact that you have a policy conference and then you will have a national conference, I don't know why we decide to call it elective. I'm not sure whether there's anything like that in the ANC constitution. Anyway, I'm told we're now calling it elective conferences. Maybe that's why policy gets pushed into the back burner, but that's a different matter. We have processes that I think we need to strengthen. And the key one is the lekgotlas that we hold. The ANC lekgotla deals with ANC policy positions, which get examined by the government lekgotla. That's how ANC policies permeate into government. And these decisions reflect themselves in the state of the nation, in the pronouncements that are being made, in terms of which direction the country is taking. And these are processes, but practically as to what impact and effect this has, I think is something that we need to examine. And in order to examine that, we need to look at the relationship between the policy instruments of the ANC, like the IR subcommittee, the relationship between that and the study group within the portfolio committee in terms of its ensuring accountability on the part of government, but also with how DIRCO execute that foreign policy, which will also be assisted by that processes. And of course, strengthen that interaction that already exists between DIRCO and the International Relations Subcommittee level. I think we need to strengthen that. And of course, as it's been said, it has to be strengthened across all of government, and down to all the structures of the ANC and spheres of government. We have done this before, we need to reinforce this, because that is how you can guarantee that these policies are implemented and permeate through to the masses of our people. And through our public diplomacy, which is weak in terms of carrying out and informing our people on what we do, including the decisions that we take in the name of South Africa in the international forum, particularly in the United Nations. There's been unnecessary controversy around those issues. And I think it's the manner in which we fail sometimes to coordinate our messaging in as far as why we have to take certain positions, which I think Zondi and have explained very clearly in terms of the context in which we find ourselves implementing the foreign policy, because it is subjected to the trends that he has described. But lastly, I think it cannot be overemphasized that for the ANC to be able to guarantee and ensure that its policies are effectively implemented at all levels and across the board by its leagues and all the alliance partners, is that you need a very strong Department of International Relations, well-resourced, that can be able to ensure that this work and the decisions are implemented. If we don't do that, we are going to be in real serious trouble. We have to strengthen the DIA, and we have to continue to strengthen through the training that Pilane and Anthony and Sanusha have indicated and involved in, of our diplomats. If we are going to avoid an evaluation of the capacity and caliber of our diplomats, then whatever policies that you develop are not going to be effectively implemented because you don't have the right people to execute those policies with very refined statecraft. Very refined statecraft in terms of practice and understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think this was very important. I think, and also ends with some very important issues when it comes to, you know, we could have all of these policy discussions, but unless you have an honest evaluation of the machinery that is necessary to actually carry out these ideas, you are essentially set up for failure. You know, tightening the issues of coordination, strengthening monitoring and evaluation, the need for a strong Department of International Affairs. I think this is something that the ANC has to, at the highest of levels, take very seriously, because I think we know what a strong Department of International Affairs did for the ANC in the past, both domestically and abroad. And I think this is something that needs to be looked at in a very honest manner. So thank you very much for that, Ambassador. Colleagues, we had planned to not go beyond 7 p.m. So what I would like to do is just do a final sort of a read through and not reading word for word of just some of the comments that have come during the discussion. And then I would like to allow Minister Zulu also to respond very briefly, just her impressions of the way that the discussion has gone, but also perhaps then to give literally 1 minute to some of the other colleagues just to make closing remarks on any issues that we have not touched on. Inside the Q&A, and remember that all of these questions, colleagues, are not necessarily questions which all have to be answered today. This is also questions that the ANC has to reflect on moving forward. So we've got somebody who is joined, and Mbuiseli Somya, who critiques the document language, sort of critiques the language, points out grammatical issues, is concerned about a clear outline of a SADC regional strategy that locates the ANC within the SADC region, and also the ANC's thinking around peace and stability. He questions, for instance, the location of the crisis in Zimbabwe as a result of sanctions, and sort of challenges the ANC to reflect on that. He also points out issues such as the SADC Strategic Indicative Plan, SADC principles, and guidelines governing democratic elections, whilst also outlining issues like Agenda 2063 and the African Continental Free Trade Area. He then further says, how does the ANC locate itself in the evolving regional instability, and how do we play a more proactive role in ensuring solidarity with those that are most marginalized and vulnerable? An anonymous attendee also mentions that national safety and security of South Africa is currently under threat. And he says, how will the international cohesion be shaped by the consolidation of the ANC and the AU in the context of the continental free trade area and continental integration? We have another attendee, TK Pue, who questions and critiques, let's say, he sort of says that the document is light on the domestic front, on domestic reforms. So that linkage between the domestic and the international. He also critiques, let's say, the ideological. I guess his point is that it tends to be more ideological than pragmatic in terms of its outlook. And one example he mentions is the issue of economic diplomacy, and that, you know, this issue has been there since 2017 and also in the 2012 policy documents. Begizizwe Nkosi says, Professor Anthony, he would like, for instance, some of those books. I think Professor Van Nooykerk is addressing that. I think also feel free, colleague, to reach out to any of the colleagues at the IGD to get some of those references that Professor Anthony was referring to, and we'll make sure you receive it. Also, there's the question of how do we locate the dynamics of ANC diplomacy and South Africa's foreign policy in the context of a region undergoing a sharp rise in authoritarianism. Will this still be business as usual? And then the last point is Daryl Swanepoel, who says, you know, we've spoken about the need for putting Africa at the center. We've also spoken about the need to keep the dialogue open for both developed and developing world. Would it not be important to have a greater emphasis on triangular dialogue to advance our own national interest, acknowledging our need as a nation to work with both? Working with one should not strain relations with the other. So this is also an interesting question. And I see that also Professor Zondi is also addressing some of those. There was also one hand by Duncan Sibifelo. Duncan, would you like to just take 15 seconds just to raise your comment, if you are still there and if your audio is fine? Please unmute yourself, Duncan. Let's see if he is able to. Okay, I don't think his mic is properly. Oh, wait. Duncan, are you able to raise your voice now? You have been given speaking rights. Okay, if you are not able to, for whatever reason, I think then let us, in the last 10 minutes that we have, allow Minister Zulu to just give her impressions before we move towards wrapping up what I think has been quite an interesting conversation, also with a lot of food for thought. Minister Zulu, the floor is yours. You are still on mute, I see. And Duncan, if you're able to sort out your microphone issues, do let me know. There we go. You are still on mute, but we can see you now.
Oh, okay. No, when I was muting, no, thank you very much. I've been taking copious notes myself. And I just want to start from a point of view that I don't want to be giving answers necessarily, because my understanding and appreciation is that we are opening up this for purposes of improving our own document. And you are doing this just before conference itself, and I'm hoping that it's arming everyone who has been, who will be going to conference anyway, including myself. This is meant, excuse me, this is meant to assist us to look at the holes, maybe if I can use that silly language, or the weaknesses in the system. And when we talk about issues that we seem to be surprised with, you know, does the ANC have, does the government have an international relations or foreign policy? It does have, but obviously when people are speaking, they're pointing to the weaknesses within what they find to be weaknesses. I also think that the point of linking the other subcommittees, as I indicated, it's clearly also coming out from the contributions that have been made here, the interlinkages or the interdependency of IR on the rest of the, or just a second for me or something. Sorry about that. I hadn't closed the door, you know, when you are working from home.
Well noted, Minister. It's also bath time for some of our children, so you might be hearing noises.
I know, there's the plates
background.
noise coming from the other side, you know. So I'm saying I hear all the comments, and I'm really excited about this. And I think that Ambassador Nhlapo actually did cover some of the issues that I would have picked up. But my view is that I didn't take this to be an answer and question session. I took it as a session where we can all come together and look at the document and highlight where we think there needs to be improvements, and highlight not only what needs to be improved now, because the advantage with this is that there's a policy conference, the final adoption of whatever policy proposal and changes that need to happen will only happen in December. And I think that's why between now and December, we need to make sure that the document that's going to be adopted at policy is not a shut out document. It's got to be a working document towards conference itself. And we must engage actually between policy conference and the national conference itself. We will have to engage very vigorously because the period between is very short. And the vigorous engagement will help, because then it means once the document is finalized by policy, it still goes back to the branches to be discussed again by the branches, by the regions, by everyone, so that come conference time, we know that we have much greater confidence on the policy proposals. The other issue that I would like to raise for me is from Zondi right down to everybody that made the comments that they made, points out to maybe what we need to do is to identify the specific areas where we think we are not doing, we have shaped, but not convincingly shaped our policy. And this issue of the, and I agree, the document which is called National Interest has been meandering for too long. And this is the time for us to finalize it. Otherwise, if you don't finalize it, then every time there's a shock, you have either a knee-jerk reaction or you go to the extreme in terms of, or maybe you even don't go anywhere, which makes it worse. So I really don't want to talk too much. Safe to say that I'm of the view the contributions that have been made here must be taken into consideration. Out of this meeting, I had suggested that we need to look at all the contributions that are going to be made, then put them in a proposal form, you know, like recommendation form, and which means we must, out of this meeting, be very specific about recommendations that we need to take to conference from the discussions that we have here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you are spot on in terms of saying this is not necessarily a traditional Q&A. This was really about giving a platform for different voices that are not necessarily involved intimately in the processes of developing either policy documents or given you know, areas that the ANC is working on, and giving an opportunity to actually input into the ANC's international relations. And I think, you know, with that, I think we should perhaps just move towards closing and just say that we've heard, you know, from a very sort of diverse group of actors who have pointed out different areas, and I think their points were complementary to one another. But I also would like to thank the ANC's International Relations Subcommittee, you know, for availing themselves through the chairperson to this particular dialogue, to listen to what other stakeholders are saying, those who have gotten an opportunity to actually give their input. And rather than going back to each and every respondent and giving them a final word, I think it would be fine if we take Minister's response as the final word for this particular webinar. And I would like to thank all those who were able to attend. And I think we've seen that the interest was really quite high in this particular dialogue, which tells us that there is still a strong interest in understanding the ANC's international relations, how it has evolved, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are. And I'd like to just say all those who were able to attend, I would like to invite you to also send in your written inputs. Send them to my colleagues, either to Mika Tekiso Kubai or to Kenny Dlamini, but you can also send it, you know, to myself. And I think what's also important to note is that this particular dialogue forms part of the Institute for Global Dialogue's dialogue series on the ANC's international relations. The first one we held was in commemoration of the legacy of O.R. Tambo, who of course spearheaded a lot of the ANC's international relations and establishing the ANC's external mission. And so this forms part of that series, and it will certainly be continuing, taking note of the fact that this particular document we're discussing today should not be seen as final, but it should be seen as an invitation for various stakeholders to make their inputs, which would then feed into a final document that would be adopted at the national conference in December. And with that, colleagues, I would like to wish you a good evening, and I look forward to future engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Time for supper.